Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome back to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's face-to-face with video series, in which we invite respected authors, speakers, teachers and researchers to share the stories behind the 10 books that influenced them the most on their life journey. And with me today is chartered occupational psychologist, therapist, coach and author Kyle Davies. Kyle is an Associate Fellow of the British Psychological Society and creator of Energy Flow Coaching, a pioneering approach to healing. We've got some strange noise interference going on. It sounds like a storm out there. Kyle, are you experiencing that at your end?
I'm actually next to a pretty major road here, unfortunately. So it looks like I'm in a ski lodge. But I'm not. I'm in a shed in the garden.
You're in a hangar.
I'm in a hangar. But yeah, so every now and again you hear them, which is the cars zooming.
Okay. So, all right. Well, we'll do our best to ignore it. I thought it was a plane taking off. But just to finish what I was saying, you know, Kyle's the author of a book called The Intelligent Body, Reversing Chronic Fatigue and Pain from the Inside Out, which offers a new understanding of the relationship between hidden stress in the body, emotional energy, and chronic health challenges. So officially, Kyle Davies, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Great to see you again.
You too. So in the introduction to your list, you said the first thing that struck you in this process is how few spiritual books you've actually read. And then the second thing was how little you remembered of some of them. So I hope you've managed to refresh your memory so we can talk about them tonight.
I know it's a bad start, really, isn't it? But I wondered actually with that thought whether is that a good thing that something has gone in, but it's not necessarily an intellectual understanding that I've needed. So I'm hoping with all of them that at some point they nudged me in a direction that was right for me at the time. So I'll do my best to remember what I can about them, but critically, I'll try and remember the influence they had at the time they had it.
Good. That's what we want to know. Yeah, we want to know how they influenced you in your journey, because we're all reading books and we're all wanting to evolve on our life path. So this is important information, and just related to what you said, I tend to think that you get what you need to get, and it goes into the muscle, and you can't necessarily remember the words or some of the thoughts or the processes, but you do remember the essence of that book. Yeah. I think it stays with you. Yeah. So let's talk about book one, which is a little bit controversial, some might think. The Truth of Vibrations by David Icke. Is this chronological? This wasn't the first spiritual book that you read or the first inspirational book?
Yeah, this probably. I'm just looking because I've got my list here, and I think this is pretty much 1 to 10 the order that these were read.
That you read them.
I think it was. So the Truth of Vibrations, David Icke. Ooh, controversial character, as you say, but. Yes. A little bit of background, I suppose, then about me. I was, I'm from Wales, so I'm from Cardiff in Wales, and I was raised. I went to the church choir. I went to Sunday school. I went to a Church of England high school, which didn't mean a great deal. It just meant, well, you're supposed to go to church every week, which I did because I sang in the choir as well. And this was, part of how I was brought up. We weren't a massively religious family, but we went to church, and it was ingrained as the upbringing. And I always felt kind of spiritually, but I never felt really that Christianity was necessarily the thing for me. But I remember then, when I went to university, and I didn't go to church anymore at that point, but felt that spiritual part of me. And then I was walking to the pub one night with some mates, and they were talking about David Icke, because in Britain, for those who don't know David Icke and his history, he was a mainstream BBC sports presenter. So, you were used to seeing him talking about soccer or snooker or something. And then he turned up on a national chat show in a turquoise kind of shell suit, saying that, well, what people were saying was he was the Son of God. Of course, that's not exactly what he was saying. But anyway, I'm walking to the pub with my mates. They're laughing. They're saying, what a complete idiot. He's obviously had a breakdown. And as they're laughing and talking, I didn't see the show, but I just had this sense in me. I thought, there's something in there. There's something I'm curious about this. This is the first time I've ever seen anything like this in my lifetime, that, a national sports presenter, national journalist has had a transformation. So I bought this book, and it was because I think it was probably so important to me because it wasn't very big, and I hadn't read anything spiritual. I'd read a little bit of the Bible, as part of being in school. And there was just something that hit me about this, about the evolution of consciousness, about how we're all on this spiritual journey, multiple lifetimes. And I thought, shit, this is mind blowing. I've never come across anything like this before. So I was about 19, I think, at the time. So that was it. It was a huge, landmark moment, I suppose, for me. I bought his second book as well, which I don't even remember what that was called. And I think that's the thing. And then I kind of left him. Went back and looked at his stuff probably about 10, 15 years later. But yeah, that first book, I think at that age, is really the first spiritual book, because I didn't know anyone that was spiritual. I knew people that went to church, and I don't know, it sounds naive in a way, but you were either kind of Christian and you went to church, or you were atheist and you didn't. And that's what Britain in the 1970s and 80s was kind of largely like. Yeah. So yeah, that was my.
So that cracked you open.
That cracked me. That cracked the shell.
That cracked the shell. I mean, what a one to crack the shell. I mean, and I remember that period. I do. I remember how vilified he was, and I remember even thinking, kind of half believing it. I didn't know anything either then. And, oh, well, if everybody's saying he's a crackpot, he must be a crackpot. But the interesting thing is now, of course, he's actually being interviewed on some of those BBC programs, and people are taking him a little bit more seriously.
I mean, he's gone from, really, I don't know how you live through that, really, because he was just the butt of all jokes in this country. He was a laughing stock, and to go from being a national household name to literally being a laughing stock, to get through that is just incredible, I think. And again, I think in those early days he was going out giving talks to kind of 2-3 people in village halls, and now he's selling tens of thousands of people around in global tours. Yeah. So and a reflection of how people have woken up, but also I think a reflection of his journey. I think from what I recall him talking about those early days, he'd been to Peru, taken ayahuasca, and I think he even talks about himself having a little bit of a breakdown because he was blown open to such an extent that he's trying, there's such a download of information that he's getting and trying to decipher this and make sense of it through his brain, and then kind of cascade that out. I suspect it was, huge, and because everybody listening at the time is just interpreting it in their own very minded way. And that was the big thing. I think it went from him saying, well, we're all part of God, we're all sons of God, so that being translated to David Icke thinks he's the new son of God, which of course isn't really what he was saying. But yeah, quite a journey for that man, isn't it? Quite a journey.
Quite, yeah, and what a lot of courage he's had, you know. I mean,
God,
just last week, on our guest last week, we were talking about Shirley MacLaine. I mean, she was somebody who had a big profile and then shocked everybody by coming out with her first book and was a bit of a laughing stock. But I think the Americans were probably a bit kinder to her than the Brits were to David Icke.
Yeah, we were brutal, weren't we? People were brutal over here, which is, yeah.
Yeah, I think we're known for that, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think
it could be nice as well.
It is kind of interesting to see, I think, how we've, you know, with social media, which in 1991, when was it, 1990, you know, we didn't have mobile phones back then. You said the world has transformed in 20 years. And, you know, it's interesting how that kind of social flagellation that he experienced, lots of people now experience through Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And you realize, you know, and I think probably everybody you've had on the show is, and I'm kind of conscious of this, as soon as you put you raise your head a little bit, people are going to take shots at you. And, you know, I've seen in the little bit of, you know, exposure I've had that, you know, people are going to come in and, you know, say all sorts of nasty things, even if you're, you know, even if you think you're doing good work. So for him, yeah, for me, it's mind blowing what he went through.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to book number 2, which is The Web of Life, Fritjof Capra. You obviously read several of his books.
I did. I read a few. I think this was kind of. I started my career as a psychologist in management consulting. You know, I came out of university. I'd experienced a lot of anxiety and depression in my late teens, early 20s. And when I came out of university, I did some counselling. I trained in some counselling. And then I went to work in consulting. And I suppose I spent a long time at university, carried a lot of that, you know, the anxiety kind of peaked, anxiety, depression peaked in the early 20s, probably because I went, you know, as things work over in this country, I spent 3 years at university as an undergraduate, where you're mixing with lots of people, you got loads of friends, lots of party time. And then I went and I was a postgraduate doing a research degree in a different town, in a place called Leicester, which is actually where David Icke is from. And I was living on my own. I was doing research on my own, and it didn't work well for me, that. Anyway, so I came home, but I obviously had that's 5 years of university, of conventional education, reductionist thinking, and I was always interested in reading things that would just challenge my way of looking at the world. And the thing I liked about the Fritjof Capra books was that I guess they were probably a little bit easier reading for me. I mean, I read some books on physics and quantum physics. I'd read some David Bohm, but that was, you know, that stuff was quite hard for me to get. You know, I'm averagely bright, so I needed something that would go in my head. So the thing I liked about the Fritjof Capra stuff, and the thing I liked about this Web of Life, was that it challenges that materialistic paradigm that we kind of have of life, which is really interesting. Paradigms are interesting, aren't they? A bit like the old cliche of fish don't know they live in water. We don't realize that we entertain a worldview. And that worldview, which is being shaken right now, but that worldview is that, well, we're living in this rock hurtling through space, random and purposeless. You know, everything is kind of matter. And again, particularly in this country, probably more than in the States, if you think anything other than that, which is the mainstream scientific view, then you're a little bit whack, or there's something, or you're not smart enough. My sense is that's the, you know, you read the broadsheets, your Guardians, your Times, that are very science focused, very mainstream, you know, academic-y. That anything deviates from that, then you're just obviously a fool, aren't you? You've got a tinfoil hat on. So the thing I liked about this Web of Life is it goes beyond that materialistic perspective, and looks at the connections between everything. And I suppose, again, for me on, beginning, because I'd read that David Icke book, but I hadn't, there's a few years gap now, because I was probably mid-20s then. And I went through a phase in my early 20s of reading a lot of Noam Chomsky. And then I had a fascination with Native American culture, so read lots about that. And then this came into, so Fritjof Capra is probably really on the periphery of a spiritual book. But it's that, opening up to seeing the connections between, everything that, all of life, really.
Well, it's that thing about science and spirituality coming together. And I think I certainly needed to see the science merging with the spirituality in order to really feel comfortable with opening up to it. I was always kind of, okay, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? And I think that we've got so much of it now, which is great. Yeah. But back then, I mean, you're in your mid-20s. Did you find that, this was something you had to keep to yourself? You're reading these kinds of books that your thinking is changing, but you can't really discuss it with your friends because, they'll say you've got a bad case of the woo.
Yeah. I had a couple of friends at that point. One friend in particular, and it was quite nice really because we'd share books. But most friends at that age, at that time, this is the mid-1990s in Britain. You were talking about football, rugby, and work, and life, and of course people were buying houses at that point in time. So you're talking about carpets and curtains and DIY skills. Are you any good with a hammer? So those are the main things that people were talking about. But I had this one friend. We'd meet for coffee, we'd meet for beer, and we'd share books. And it's great, really, because actually he's still one of the people in my life that 25 odd years later, that we still kind of talk about these things. We still talk about the books we're reading and the experiences we've had. So which is nice.
So book number 3 is one that has come up before a few times, and that's the Holographic Universe. Michael, talk about
it. This was probably read around about the same time. This was a recommendation from that friend, my mate Vern. And again, I think is drawing on that idea. It draws on the work of Carl Pribram and David Bohm, again, who just mentioned, with the fact that everything is connected, but just that mind-blowing concept that this could be a projection from the end of the universe, from one part of the universe, that everything is connected. Well, that's the nub of it, isn't it? Is that everything is contained within everything else. And I think for me, that's the big spiritual notion that we kind of carry with us, is that God is within you, everything is within you, the universe is within you. And if it were to be true that this is holographic and it is some form of projection, well, that's or maybe it's a computer game that we're all little pawns in. And that would be kind of interesting. But so I think it just one of those kind of mind expanding books back at that 25, 26, 27. And I would say, with all of these books, I read them once, and they had their impact, and I kind of moved on. But I've never been the sort of person that's gone back and reread. Probably most of the,
So what was happening as you're reading these books? What's happening to the career side? I mean, was this something separate from what you did in your daily life, or were you beginning to feel, I'm doing this work, I'm a psychologist, a therapist, but now suddenly the ideas around that were changing too?
Yeah, I wasn't a therapist at that point. I did when I came out of university, I did some counselling, and that was kind of before I went into consulting. So I was working, in consulting, doing a variety of things from executive coaching, management development, organizational development, those sorts of things. And it was probably around that time that, and I suppose because these books were opening me up, broadening my perspectives on myself and life, I wanted to go a little deeper, which was then when I began therapy training, because I was doing executive coaching in organizations. And certainly back then, 25 years ago, it's interesting how things are different now, but back then, you were really talking about an individual at work. There was no interest. Nothing was covered about the individual outside of work. It was the individual, their role as a manager, the skills they had. And it was, I suppose, because of me beginning to open up and expand, I thought I need to go deeper. There's more, I can't, if I'm going to really make an impact, I need to go beyond just talking about this person's skill set and what training they need and that sort of stuff. So it was then towards the late 90s, I then started therapy training and then opened my first therapy practice in 1999. And yes, and I think the books that come from that point forward, then began to have an influence on the nature of the work that I did.
I'll just digress slightly and say that if you get another vehicle making a noise, if you just stop until it's gone, then it will be much easier for us when it comes to editing this. We can edit that sound out, but we can't do that if we're talking over it.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Number 4.
Sorry.
That's fine. It happens, that's life. Number 4, Love Without End, Glenda Green.
Yes, this was an interesting one because I started my therapy practice in 1999, and then in the early 2000s, I was introduced to a medical doctor who was based up in Scotland, a guy called David Mickle, and we started working together. David had a particular interest in chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, fibromyalgia, because his girlfriend at the time had it. He was very deeply frustrated as a medical doctor. There wasn't anything he could do. He did a bunch of the same therapy training that I'd done, and he'd started then to apply some of these ideas to some of his patients in his practice, and noticed he was making a difference and things were beginning to work. So I was introduced to him, started to work with him, and we began to pioneer this approach. But critically, I suppose, for me, David was also a very much into spiritual work. And this, which was interesting to me, because again, I hadn't, apart from my mate, it wasn't so much, he wasn't spiritual at the time, my mate from school. So David was probably the first person I met that was arguably a spiritually orientated person, which the thing that I suppose amazed me about it was that I thought of spiritual people as possibly a little bit wacky, wearing tie-dye or hugging trees. And there's me, just a regular guy, and David was as well. So I think that was something that was a huge, I guess, kind of perspective shifter, really, that anyone can be spiritual. And I know it sounds a bit dopey, really, but it's these things change your perspective on stuff. So this was a book that David had recommended to me, and it was, it's a book that the author Glenda Green talks about her experiences with Jesus and the teachings that come through that. So I think in the early days of us developing the work that we were doing, it was this had an influence, and I think in the early days it was kind of interesting because we were developing a mind-body approach at a time in the early 2000s where mind-body work was not people were not kind of greeting that with with open arms, particularly. So it was, it wasn't easy to kind of convey or get the message out there of what we were doing. But I think also the kind of thing with it was that we were influenced by these spiritual ideas, and we were, we had this almost trying to reconcile this. We're dealing with medical problems, yet there is this strong spiritual influence on the work. So the truth be told on this book, I don't remember a huge amount about the content of it, but I just remember it was something that almost brought David and I together as we were developing the early stages of this work.
Your fifth book, I am pleasantly surprised to see this here. It's the first time this book has appeared in the club, and it's also the first time the author has. And I have to be transparent and say I had a hand in this book. So it is a particular favourite of mine. Yes, I worked closely with Steve Wather on his book, Spiritual Psychology. So I'm curious to know how it impacted you.
Well, and it still does, really. This is, this might be the most influential book, or is that difficult to say? Knowing Steve. So Steve had, I'm trying to think, for about 2005, 2006, I first met Steve. And Steve had a huge influence. He was a catalyst, really, I suppose, for me. One of the things that was evident in the relationship I had with David Mickle was that, certainly to begin with, he was more of the teacher in the relationship and I was more of the student. And that, as we grew, that began to shift. And it was Steve that was, that almost provided a platform for me. So he gave me the opportunity to speak at a couple of his events. In fact, a spiritual psychology event was one of those that I spoke at with David. But it was that, I don't know, Steve said he saw something in me, and just little things like that make a huge difference. So I at one level, I'm eternally grateful to Steve, because it's almost like he gave me that kick up the arse to get me moving. But also, I think critically with this book, it just had a huge, and continues to have a huge influence on my work. So, one of the simple principles of the work that I do. So, I work with a broad range of clients. For many years, worked almost exclusively with people with chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, fibromyalgia, adrenal fatigue. Now it's broader, anxiety, depression as well. But there are kind of basic principles that underpin, what the work is. And one of those is that a symptom is purposeful. A symptom is trying to tell us something. Now, most people in the spiritual world already kind of know that. Now, the way we have dealt with that, the way I deal with that, is that, well, it's quite direct. A symptom that arises, at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon when I'm having a coffee in Starbucks is trying to tell me something about what's going on and what's going on with me, my relationship with me, how I'm interacting with life at 2:30 in Starbucks. So, that's one of the key principles of the work. But underneath all of the symptoms that people experience, they all cluster around deeper patterns. And there's a big influence of this book from Steve on those patterns. So I can see how the clusters come together. So I think that's a big bit for me about this work. I think, and I'm kind of surprised that this isn't bigger. I know there are lots of models out there, and I'm always I kind of believe that it's not that there's a truth. As your consciousness shifts, truth shifts, because you things are different. You see the world in a different way. You understand things in a different way. And there are models for how we represent personality and these sorts of things. But what Steve is doing is saying, well, fundamentally, there are 12 life lessons that people have, and when you come into life, you as part of kind of your contract, that these lessons are wired in. So you're going to attract things into your life that are going to provide an opportunity for you to master these life lessons. And things are going to come at you in a blind spot. So you'll either find that you get knocked over by something, or you just don't see it coming and you can't see it happening, probably until you're right in the middle of it. And, I would find this, and I find this all the time with my clients, that they don't see things coming. and yet maybe their best friend doesn't have a problem with this. They saw it come in, or it just doesn't happen to them, and that's because it's not their life lesson. And then seeing how for people history repeats itself, and it's the same. I always get the same boss. I moved from that job to this job, and it's almost like I've got the same guy. Always have the same girlfriend. Why does this always happen to me? So those things, are so evident with the clients that I see, that this is, I think, such a profound book. And I'm sure there are probably lots of theories around personality and how traits and types cluster together, and if you're this type, this will happen for you. But I don't know, there's just something kind of deeper about this work, and I think it's just incredibly useful, and it's just incredibly empowering, because all of Steve's work is empowerment focused. My work is empowerment focused. It's all about, well, how can I own my experience here? Because when it comes to people's suffering, the huge part of why people suffer is because they resist and reject the experience that they have, right? Seeing themselves as a victim of life rather than part of that flow of life. And I think this book really does help with that. It gives that opportunity to say, oh, actually, it may be that I'm rubbish at dealing with this. I'm rubbish at dealing with people who treat me badly, whereas you may be good at it, but this isn't a life lesson for you, whereas you just can't tell the truth, and that's part of your life lesson. Yeah. I think that understanding that gives an opportunity to own it, embrace it, rather than berate oneself for it. And I think that's frequently what we do, is, oh, I can't believe I'm doing this again. It's like, well, I'm doing this again because I'm learning to master this life lesson. And isn't it wonderful? I have this opportunity confronting me right now, slapping me in the chops, enabling me to kind of master this. So yeah, a huge influence. And again, I've only read it once, so I'm hoping what I'm saying about it is actually true, because I've taken it and I've created my own sort of version of it in my head. But yes, forever grateful to Steve Rother, a wonderful man.
Many think so, and many are forever grateful to him as well. Book number 6, The Path of Empowerment, Barbara Marciniak.
Yeah, this is the Pleiadians. There's lots of people that channel the Pleiadians these days, aren't there? I think the one thing that, as a psychologist and therapist and coach, I'd always try to practice just an intuitive approach to the way that I worked. And I'm not psychic, but I'm intuitive. So it's that thing. Well, just attune to that true self, higher self, and then open your mouth and hope that what comes out resonates with a client. And it would, it's nice when that happens and a client comes back next week and says, oh, what you said to me last week was brilliant. That really had a massive impact. And it's, well, what did I say? So obviously psychics know all about that. But one of the thing that I liked, and I liked about this book, so I think I was in Belgium doing a training course, and somebody who was partaking in that course that Dave and I were running at the time had offered this book, and I hadn't heard of Barbara before, and thought, oh, okay, well, let's have a look at this. And I was just amazed, because there were little things that I would have said to clients that clients would have come back to me that I was then now reading in this book. I was thinking, wow, that's, it's a little bit, that's interesting. And I think, that, I suppose I've had that with various other Pleiadians. So Wendy Kennedy is somebody that channels a Pleiadian as well. And I've had similar experiences with Wendy, in as much as I would have said something to a client, or maybe I've had a flavor of the month of what I'm talking about with clients, and then I listen to a channel a couple of weeks later by Wendy, or read something that she's read, she's written, and she's writing the same thing. So it's sort of confirming in a way. But probably the big thing again is this path to empowerment, and again, because my work has always been about empowering people. Books that talk about empowerment are, have a big influence. And I think, we like to read what we already know, don't we? And I suppose I found, and this is the issue, there are a couple of books that are on this list that are on this list, because I've read them and I thought, well, this is brilliant, because this is exactly what I say to my clients. I think one of the things when you're on your own, and I've been working on my own, largely on my own for, I've got a couple of people that work around me, but largely on my own for the last 10 years, is that when you're doing that and you're kind of ploughing your own field, so to speak, it's nice to not be validated, but just to have some confirming messages that actually you're not just making stuff up. But obviously you are kind of making it up to a certain extent, but it's nice to hear what other people are saying the same thing. So I'm not just, it's not just me being a bit weird.
Tapping into the same source.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, I suppose I feel there's a responsibility, because I'm dealing with people that are not well. People have been diagnosed with something by their doctor. So I'm not just giving over ideas. So I suppose I feel there's a responsibility on me there, that what I'm offering people as a means by which they eradicate their symptoms, it really ought to work. And of course, it's because we're all evolving so quickly, the work has had to evolve. And I think that's, it's nice to be able to read books and know, right, well, yeah, we are all tapping into the same thing. And I'm not just giving people deaf advice.
Book number 7. She was on this show some months ago. Love her book. One of my favourite ladies, Penny Pierce, Frequency, The Power of Personal Vibration. Impacted me a great deal. Tell me how it impacted you.
I think I read this when my children were small. I just can't get over how she's not massive. I mean, I'm friends on Facebook with her.
She is quite big internationally.
Is she? Because I just think the stuff is just brilliant. I think her stuff is absolutely brilliant. I suppose that there are kind of big names, aren't there? And I suppose I'm thinking, well, she should be a big name. But yeah, that the whole vibrational thing, the whole attuning to wisdom, the whole understanding and interpreting from, I think she calls it your home base, and coming back to your home base. Again, it just very much, in alignment with how I've worked, really. I've talked about true self, and I know a lot of people use that little phrase, really, but it can mean anything from home base to your higher self, to your innate wisdom, to whatever it is. And I think, spiritual people are largely talking about the same thing, and more so now, that it is all about coming back to that. The essence of my work is that from birth onwards, people go through various bits of trauma, and they learn to shut down, and they learn to, become misaligned from that true self or home base. And then they shut down their emotions and their feelings, and then they become something that they're not. And we have to go through that process of realigning them. So I think that, it was one of those books for me at a time of developing. And I was at this point, I think, at the start of working on my own. I thought the ideas she had in it were brilliant, really. And yeah, I think she should be bigger.
Yeah. Number 8, Memoirs of a Master, Adamus, St. Germain, through Jeffrey and Linda Hoppy. I love Adamus. He's incorrigible.
Yeah, and I think this is, I suppose, in needing to be honest, really, this is more about putting something in this list because of the influence of Jeff, Linda, Crimson Circle on me. So I've followed the work since just after Steve, actually. I think it was the very first event of Steve's I went to in Hawaii in 2006, and people were talking about Jeff and Linda. So immediately I started to track the work, and I just, from the channeling of Tobias through to to the work now. And yeah, I think it really goes brilliantly with, obviously your stuff of the no bullshit, because that's what the Adamus approach is. And that was, which for me is awesome, because there is definitely, I got to be careful what I say here, but there's definitely an identity that around being a spiritual person, and there is a jargon that goes with being a spiritual person. You know, isn't it? My life's amazing. I'm manifesting all these brilliant things. You know, all that kind of stuff. And I'd be thinking, oh, my life's all over the place. You know, I have some good days, but I have some really shit days too. How come yours is so good? So I love the fact that it kind of cuts through. And it's that path of realization. And again, in terms of my work, you know, just touching on what I was saying earlier, so much of suffering is about resistance. I know that idea is as old as the hills, but a huge part of the message of Davies is just allowing self. And, you know, there's a huge frustration in that, because it's like, well, how am I not allowing myself? Because you're resisting. But that allowing, and increasingly allowing of self, has been a message that I think for me has been evident for the last, 10 years. Since Davies has been coming through. So yeah, I think this, and there are just, there's a couple of books that, you know, could be on this list, and just little stories, beautiful little stories that, you know, talk about the master from the, you know, giving you the perspective of the master, whether he's sitting on a park bench or whether he's talking to a student. And you know, in each one, I can see little bits of me in both master and student, but it's just beautiful tales that you can, for me, learn to know, you know, a huge amount from.
Yeah, I agree. You know, it's also simple, and that's what I like about Davies. It is simple. It's us that complicate it. But yeah, so good one to read if people haven't come across Davies' work. So is it a motorbike or a car?
I can't see. That's the thing, is I've got a fence just here, and at the other side of the fence is the road, and there's a roundabout. So they come up and they hit the roundabout. So that's the thing, is I can't see them. So if I'm in the flow of saying something, it's sort of too late, because they've hit the roundabout and they've slowed down. So I do apologise. That's
all right. We'll cut that piece out when we edit. Okay, so number 9, the Sophia or Sophia Code, Kaya Ra. That's an interesting one.
Yeah, this is an interesting book, because it essentially comprises encoded activations, and there are a number of them. I can't remember how many. So I listened to a lot of this book, and you can listen to the activations in a meditative kind of way, or you can just listen, you know, or you can read. But this was something that I'd read only a few years ago. So we're right up now till about 3 years ago, when I went through divorce, which was just a pretty harrowing period for me. And I had kind of become friends with a guy here over in the UK, who's a spiritual guy, and he'd recommended this book to me, and he'd recommended it as something that could really provide a bit of comfort, maybe some support, something to help let go of fear as I move through divorce. Because for me, going through divorce, I'd see myself as a good husband, as a good father. Loved the family home, loved being part of a family. So when this fell apart, my identity fell apart, and there was a huge amount of fear and a scrambling round to kind of hold on to that. Now it played a huge role in the evolution of my work from when that period started in sort of 2017 until now. But I think this book is not an intellectual book. It is really it's an experiential book that, I think, as I say, more than anything for me, it was in a meditative way, listening to that, those activations, and having the experience of that, and just being aware of the shifts. I think it's always, for me, it's always difficult with a book. Maybe this is a science hat on, is that there are so many factors at any one time that are influencing us. I find it incredibly difficult to say, right, well, this made this difference, because there's so many things that are happening. But there's no doubt for me that book and the contents of it, it's the contents of all of them, isn't it? But the contents of it did have an influence and probably facilitated my spiritual path particularly, and helped me and my work through what was a very difficult period for me.
So number 10, what's in the way is the way. Mary O'Malley.
Yeah, another book that sort of aligns with my work. And again, I think, part of my work, I talk about this idea of, well, we have innate well-being, and we almost a bit like sort of thing I say to clients, a couple of little analogies. I say, when you those days you head to the airport and it's really thick grey cloud and it's drizzly rain, which is often happens over here, and it's all a bit miserable, and then you get on that plane and then the plane goes through the clouds and there's blue sky. Oh, wow, blue sky, that's amazing. But of course the blue sky was always there. It's just that we, those clouds, we kind of get stuck in them. It's almost like we can think they're real. So part of my work is this notion that, well, we have innate well-being, and the blue sky is always there. That's our true self. Our true self is always connected to the flow of life, to the flow of all that is. But what happens is that we very often get stuck in the clouds, and the clouds are the narratives, the stories, the beliefs, the conceptions of reality that we manufacture within ourselves. And when I don't know how I came across this book by Mary O'Malley, but she was saying exactly the same thing. And she talks about, coming back to that, that wellspring within, and, coming into the body, softening the body, which is, I think, well, this is, you're saying exactly what I say, which is, again, it's fantastic stuff. So, again, much of my work is that has that body focus, but also the connection to beyond the body, that true self. And that she just had that very same idea and describes this, it's clouds around your head. And I think she talks about a meadow. You have the meadow, that it's always there. You're walking through that meadow, just a cloud descends on your head. And that's, that's your destructive, dysfunctional thinking, which is just getting in the way. And it's not that there actually is a problem, it's just a problem of your creation, which is very difficult to kind of get your head around to when you're in the clouds. But the more you become embroiled and the more you feed those clouds, the bigger and thicker they get, and the harder it is to see the blue sky. And what I suppose one of the principles of my work is actually you just disengage from that, and the clouds automatically begin to thin. You don't have to do anything. People are often in that space that they've got the clouds, they're stuck in pain, and they're frantically trying to fix themselves, and usually that involves more thinking, and more thinking just thickens up those clouds. So yeah, a great book, and one probably would have read that about 2 years ago, and that brings us right up to now, really. So that's your 10 best. I'm going to come back to what you said there about the truth, because I think there's some important, it is an important part of your work, and I do have a few questions about it. But before we go there, what are you reading now? I've actually just started, that friend who I was talking about, Dr. Merlin Picton, he's just brought out a book, and it's Journey to Awakening the True Self. So I've just started reading that, but only opened the cover yesterday. So I can't tell you what that's like.
Okay, well let's talk about the true self, because you say that it's possible to heal ourselves from various illnesses by coming back to our true self, or connecting reconnecting to our truth. How do you help people reconnect to their truth?
I think in trying to keep it simple, doing it through the body. So I think in the Western world, we live in our heads. Everything is kind of channeled through that mental medium, and we have a level of thinking, and if we have a problem, we just up our level of thinking, assuming that will solve the problem. So essentially, it's the idea that, well, your true self is always there. You can't be disconnected from it because it's there. It's a bit like the blue sky. It's always there. They're just clouds that get in the way. So I tend to say, well, we just become misaligned, but it's there. It's communicating with you.
But how to get people to really
get into it is
to get into that? Yes.
So if I were working with somebody with symptoms, it's the idea, well, your body is telling you directly through symptoms, whether it's anxiety, depression, fatigue, pain, that you are, that you are misaligned, and it's trying to bring you back. But there's also emotion involved in that, and emotion is trying to bring us back to our true self. So my perspective is that very often when emotions get blocked over a period of time, then the body and brain send symptoms. And so it's almost like underneath those symptoms are emotions. We're not feeling them. There's a rewiring that's taken place in the brain. Things are ramped up. So it's almost like the body shouts at us. It's trying to get its message through. So underneath there are emotions, but we can learn to block feelings, if that makes sense. So our emotions and feelings are slightly different. Emotions are a non-conscious process that happen throughout body and brain and affect absolutely everything. We know, and it's almost an instinctive thing when we go through difficult issues or if we go through trauma, that we can block our feelings. It doesn't stop emotion. What happens is you have a rewiring of the brain, and then everything goes out of whack, and then there's the experience of symptoms. So working with somebody with symptoms, it's translating that back, get back into the body, and then begin to feel. If I'm working with somebody without symptoms, it's pulling somebody out of their head, but identifying, well, where are the problems? Where are things going wrong? Where are you feeling overwhelmed? Where are things breaking down for you? And it's coming back into always bringing it back to the body. What happens is that the head, the mind, will want to look outside, and the body, the true self, is in the body. So usually, again, another little principle of my work is that, well, our experience flows through us. It's created within us, and it kind of comes and flows through us. For the most part, we exist in a paradigm which is life out there is directly causing everything that I'm feeling in here. So if I want to change how I feel in here, and I do because it's horrible, I need to change something out there. Mm-hmm. It's not, what the gurus know is, well, it isn't the case. That's not the case. It's entirely possible for you to have a range of feelings, regardless of what's going on out there, because your feeling experience is created in here. But what happens is when people get into discomforts and problems and things go wrong, they go up into their head to escape their feelings, and their head, of course, is pointing to the external, and then think about, well, what do I need to fix out there? And then people get caught in mind loops where they go round and round. What if this? What if that? What's going to go wrong? What's not going to work? Whereas really what they need to be doing is coming back into the body, dropping attention into the body, and just opening up, creating space and allowing. So it almost goes against some of, I think, this work is the opposite to our instinct, because our instinct is to go up into the head. Our instinct is to block and resist what we feel, because I'm afraid of what I feel because of what it means about me. I'm afraid of what I feel because I might drown in it. And coming back into the bodies and allowing without having to solve it is a huge thing, because again, the brain is like, you shouldn't be feeling this and you need to solve it. This is a problem, you need to solve it. But just being with something and, well, I don't need to solve it. What I feel is not a problem. Yeah, maybe guiding me to do something, put a boundary in place, speak my truth, whatever it may be. But what I feel is not a problem. So coming back, and I think we gain mastery over our feelings by allowing them, creating that space, allowing them to come up, witnessing them, and then acting when we need to. That is what brings us back to the true self. There's a layer of conditioned emotional feelings, which is, you know, compulsions, those sorts of things. But underneath that, you know, that's the thing, is coming underneath the surface level conditioned feelings, getting underneath to those nudges, the intuitions, the knowing, the realizations, the insights that I think that's the true self.
Do you think that all people with fibromyalgia, or you know, some of these, what's the other one? Can't think of the name of it now, but you know, that people used to say doesn't exist, but they now know does. Do you think it's all to do with emotions? None of it has a physical cause. The physical is created by the emotional.
I think that I think there are multiple primary causes. So I think when we're looking at, so I look at it that when a body and brain is in a prolonged period of stress, then it begins to break down. And it's entirely possible for the body and brain to be in a state of stress without just being aware of it. But critically, stress is more than that overwhelming feeling, that agitated feeling that people have. You know, whether it's physical, environmental, or emotional, the stress response is largely the same. You know, the way I talk about it with clients is, well, it's like you have a stress bucket. But if you've fallen down a flight of stairs, you've had a case of flu, you've got a really bad diet, you're not getting much sleep, you're working, sat down all day in a dark room with no natural light, and you just split up with your partner, they're all stressors. So they all go in the stress bucket. So the way I look at it, it's a load. You know, it's almost like if you know, if you're holding something and you're holding it for a long period of time, and you may be holding books, and then books get loaded up, and then it's a little pamphlet on the top, and then your arms go, you can't take it. It's almost like, well, it's not the pamphlet, it's the load that's resulted. Often what we, you know, because of our medicalized mindset, we're always looking for a single cause, because that's how medicine evolved. Medicine evolved looking at injuries and infections. And it's like, well, here's a set of symptoms, here's a specific cause, here's a treatment. And of course, medicine is brilliant at dealing with those sorts of things. But where medicine falls down, unfortunately, is with the plethora of chronic health challenges that we have these days, and they're mainly lifestyle related. So it's all about, you know, it's all about understanding what's in that stress bucket. Now, my work is mainly on looking at the emotion, because the emotion connects to our life lessons and our conception of who we are. But there are simple things. But I do look at everything else as well. So I will look at diet, I will look at exercise, I will look at sleep. But your example with fibre is interesting, because I will have people that will say to me, I had a car accident and and that caused my fibro. And I would generally say, I would look at the car accident as like the pamphlet, like the proverbial last straw, where it will have caused some structural damage. But very often then people will say, oh, well, actually, yeah, when I look at it, you know, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia 5 years ago when I had that car accident, but I'd had anxiety and IBS before that. And, you know, when I was a kid in school, I used to have migraines. And this is the idea that the body will use different symptoms, and essentially the severity and intensity of symptoms will increase over time. And there's a cyclic nature to that. So symptoms often come and then maybe they recede, or maybe life circumstances change, or maybe the stress bucket empties itself. So yeah, I wouldn't want to say it's all about emotion, but I think a huge amount of it is connected to emotion.
This is predominantly, I would imagine, like a therapy session, a talk therapy. So you could do it at a distance. You could do it through Zoom or Skype, correct?
I do probably 90% of my work with people remotely overseas, really. So, you know, well, I do most of it online, but we do have a large number of people that are overseas. So anyone that speaks English. Yeah, I mean, obviously with any kind of work, it's an energy exchange. It's not psychotherapy, but it is, you know, what I'm doing is, I guess I'm guiding people on a journey back to themselves, and I'm offering some principles and ideas to help them on that route. What I'm trying to do is simplify things, and I'm trying to get people to look inside. I think they say with the mind, I think we have a preoccupation with looking outside of ourselves. You know, give me the 5 steps to losing weight, give me the 10 steps to getting fit, you know, this sort of stuff. You know, should I do yoga? Should I meditate? And for me, it's all about coming and looking much more inside and being with that and beginning to understand. So it's raising self-awareness. So whilst it does take place for the most part in this way, the healing is done by individuals between sessions as they put the principles into practice.
Yeah. So you wrote the book, The Intelligent Body, Reversing Chronic Fatigue and Pain from the Inside Out. And you published that a couple of years ago, wasn't it? 2 or 3 years ago? 2018?
Yeah, that came out, I think, 2017, 2018. So, I'm hoping I've got a couple more up my sleeve. I'm just waiting for them to pop out.
Yeah, well, that's what books do, like babies. So the book itself, I remember talking to you about the book a few years ago when it was first published. We did an interview, and it really does contain a lot of insight and a lot of things for people to work with themselves. I mean, you'll get ideas popping out the whole time as you're reading the book. Some of the things that you're sharing in it, that's correct, right? Yeah,
no, absolutely. I think that the kind of idea of the book really is it's a bit of a light touch of what my work is all about. It's in 2 parts. So the first bit gives a bit about the theory, and again, because of the nature of the clients that I'm working with, there's a spiritual undertone to all of it, but I'm trying to be sciencey as well. And like you said, I'm like you in that way. I like to bring the science and spiritual bits together. I don't want to go too far off with either, really.
Well, and I don't think we have to anymore. I think it's very, very clear that they do come together. Quite naturally.
We're seeing that more and more. And as I say, with that, I just think this materialistic paradigm that we're having, and we're having more scientists challenge that and saying, well, actually, the universe is more like an evolving organism than it is just, a big giant clock that's ticking. And things don't seem random. There are patterns. There does seem to be meaning. So there's way more to this than we think. And which is, I think, great because it kind of paves the way. And I think there are some brilliant scientists out there. Rupert Sheldrake, who's not on my list, but he's a hero of mine.
Mine too.
Another one of those that's been trailblazing, been out there. And these people are heroes, I think. So I think Rupert gets a mention in my book. I think because I talk a little bit about the brain as being something of a receiver, decoder, transmitter, more than a TV that just transmits, because it does have to interpret and decode and whatnot. But that's one of the ideas of Rupert Sheldrake. And another idea I loved of his was the idea that memory is contained within morphic fields. So it's not that memory is a bank, that it's all there, but almost like tuning forks, it's held as potential, and then when it resonates, and something resonates with you, then it kind of drops it. And that I one of the reasons I love that idea was because I discovered that through the work that I do, that we can almost heal. I hope this doesn't sound too ridiculous, but we'd almost heal people's trauma by accident. And what I mean by that was I had a number of people quite early on with the work that said, well, look, I've got like PTSD symptoms. I get flashbacks, memories that just kind of pop into my head, which I can't control. It's quite scary. And because I'd done hypnotherapy and tapping and other types of work before beginning this mind-body journey, I'd say, well, okay, well, what we'll do is we'll do the work on your physical symptoms of fatigue and pain, and we'll come back and look at the PTSD symptoms later. What they said to me was that, this is really interesting. At the end of the process, my physical symptoms are gone, but I'm not haunted by those memories anymore. I can consciously recreate them, but they don't have that overwhelming, negative experience. I thought, well, that's really interesting. I wonder whether what's happened is that an individual has changed their frequency. So like the tuning fork thing, they're now not tuning into the memory in the same way. So, and it just resonated then with that Rupert Sheldrake idea that, well, everything is held as a potential somewhere. Sorry, I ground to a halt then, didn't I?
So if somebody wants to, dip a toe in the water, the best place to start is with the book, because it tells them, what they need to know, and it gives them an opportunity to really start thinking, go inside and, start thinking about this. Yeah. And the name of the process that you've developed, energy flow coaching, listening to you speak, what that reminds me of is in the same way that an acupuncturist, will work on the meridians, and where the flow is blocked, they're kind of releasing it. You're doing exactly the same thing in a different way.
Yeah, it's the idea that the flow of the true self there's a valve that almost gets closed. When that closes, then we experience problems. So it's learning for ourselves to open that up, and I suppose that's the empowerment piece. That's why I've been drawn to Penny Pierce, to Steve, because there's so much of that empowerment work of you can do this yourself.
Yes.
And I think that's in a culture that is becomes so dependent on experts, particularly within the healthcare field, of give me something, do something for me. And whilst obviously there's a space for that, there's most certainly a space for we have that potential to probably far more than we think to be able to deal with ourselves. When we hear, aren't we, and how we evolved over hundreds of thousands of years was by being incredibly resilient and resourceful. And I think very often in our safe-ish modern lives, we've often forgotten how resourceful and resilient we are. So the kind of, not so much the tools, but the ability, the capacity lies within us to facilitate our own flow. And all I do is just try to give people a nudge on the path.
Well, I totally agree with you. And I think if you look at the healthcare system in America and in England and many countries now, they're all falling apart. We have got to learn to be our own healers. This is where it begins. It's our body. Nobody's going to care for it as much as we do. And nobody knows it as well as we do. Yeah. So before we close, these two books that you kind of, just threw in, that are hoping or wanting to pop out, what might they be about? What more have you got to say?
I'm not entirely sure. I did one of the things I was curious about was writing about divorce, and certainly for men, I'm interested in doing a little bit more work with men, because I think men seem to be really in crisis. And I suppose one thing that is interesting is probably 10 years ago, even up to 5 years ago, 90% of the clients in my private practice would be females, whereas it's 50-50 now. So I think men are beginning to open up. But something that I was aware of through my mid-40s was that many, many men are in crisis and suffering in silence. So that was something. The idea at the moment is that it feels to me that much of what I talked about with clients is that it's almost the opposite of everything they know, from a cultural perspective, a conditioning perspective, and to a certain extent an instinctive perspective, because that instinct to resist and to think. So that's where what I'm currently feeling is writing a book which is called The Opposite of Everything You Know, and just outline these principles of how, right, well, there are simple things that can be done, you can do, which just turn on its head what you normally do, and that can make a huge difference to your experience of life and your spiritual flow.
Sounds like an interesting book, certainly one that I'd want to interview you about, so get writing.
Thank you.
I'll be on your case. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your 10 best and sharing, the stories about your own life path and how it's evolved over the years. It's always fascinating. You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, well, that's it for today. Thank you. You can go to energyflowcoaching.com and learn more about Kyle's work, the Energy Flow Coaching packages at his website, and also the Intelligent Body Reversing Chronic Fatigue and Pain from the Inside Out, which is published by Norton & Co. I'll be back next week at the same time. Actually, I won't be back next week at the same time. I'm taking a rare week off. I'll be back the week after at the same time. So In the meantime, you can go over to the No BS Spiritual Book Club and you can watch edited versions of any of these videos. There's probably about 60 or 70 there now that you can see, and Kyle's will be edited and added next week. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you.
Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.